Warm welcome to everyone. It's a real privilege to have you all here tonight, including our dear friend and guest, Dr. Sāgaradevī Barratt, who is a member of Mind and Life Europe and a senior lecturer in the School of Health and Social Care at the University of Essex, program lead for MSc Medical and Clinical Education, and contributor to the Professional Doctorate in Clinical Psychology program. And she will talk about Enaction, Relevance Realisation, and the development of wisdom-informed approaches to contemplative education, which is quite a recent theoretical work and interest of hers, to our greatest pleasure, because we are really interested in combining the enactive approach and education, contemplative education especially. So thank you, Sāgaradevī, for joining us tonight and preparing your talk and doing this research over the last year or so. We are really eager to hear more, and hopefully we can have a lively discussion after your talk. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Gabor, and thank you for the introduction to speak. So I'm just going to do the sharing of my screen bit. Here we are. Oh, this is a couple of slides too early. Just 1 second. Okay, we'll start with the outline. So yeah, tonight I'm going to be talking about some ideas that are really quite new to me as well. And I hope that this is going to be kind of the start of a fruitful kind of theoretical conversation. And certainly nothing that I'm saying this evening is kind of set in stone, but I'm hoping that what it does is provoke some really interesting questions around the area of contemplative education and its connections with Enaction, and also the theory of relevance realisation, which I hope I'm going to illustrate is really connected to the enactive approach. So I'm going to talk a little bit, first of all, about why this and why now, because I think context is important when we think about where ideas are coming from. I'm then going to talk about the enactive approach and contemplative education. So what's the connection that I'm making there? I'm then going to move on to explore relevance realisation, which I realise may be quite a new or a completely new concept for some of you. It still feels like a very new idea to me. And then hopefully what I'm going to do is connect this with wisdom, what we mean by wisdom, the development of wisdom, and then hopefully present some summary and discuss the implications. And some of the implications, the more that I think about it, the implications are for contemplative education, but I think they raise implications for education more broadly as well. So I hope to touch on that too. Okay. So why this and why now? So I've been involved with contemplative education since about 2014, when I went to an event in the United States and came back thinking, I really need to be talking about these ideas. And I set up something called the Contemplative Pedagogy Network in 2014 that connected educators in the UK and Europe who were interested in the idea of using contemplative practice, particularly in higher education, was our focus. But by sort of 2020, 2021, I felt that I was struggling with, I was unable to kind of process or articulate some of the ideas that I had. And I took a year off work around this time and really enjoyed having the space to kind of explore some new ideas. So I guess that's important to how these ideas have come about. And I'm just going to find my notes to check that I don't miss anything. Yeah, so one of the problems I found was around when I was talking about the implications of contemplative practice, I kind of knew from my own experience how profound insight generated through contemplative practice could be, not only to the things that I understood, but just to my experience in the world and how I saw the world. And I came up against real difficulty about how we articulate this, particularly in settings of education where there's an assumption of secularity and a need to embrace a whole range of different cultural and religious perspectives. So during my time out, I explored the work of Francisco Varela a little more, and also came across the work of John Vervaeke, who's been leading a lot of the work around relevance realisation. I also handed over leadership of the Contemplative Pedagogy Network to a team of great people who are continuing some great work there. And so the outcome of that thinking is really what I'm going to present today. But there were a few kind of contextual factors that have kind of fed into this work. So firstly, there's been increasing discussion about the risks and benefits of using contemplative practice in education settings, particularly in schools that I'm really interested in, particularly in settings where the people who are participating may not have a choice, for example, if they're children and it's a class activity, and to the potentially unsettling effects that some of these practices might lead to, particularly in settings that are really under-resourced, which is very much the case in British schools, particularly right now. So there's that kind of contextual debate that I'm interested in. There's also increasing emphasis, or maybe it's me perceiving this, but I sense from the writing on wisdom that there is more of a discussion about how we move education beyond being about propositional knowledge, intellectual knowledge, and the importance of that for actually addressing some of the social, environmental, political challenges that we face at the moment. And the other contextual factor is around increasing awareness of the limits of Cartesian dualism, subject-object duality, for tackling the complexity of the challenges that human beings face. And particularly the work of Sebastian Voros and Evan Thompson, who's recently released The Blind Spot, really feeds into this. So that's the kind of context that I want to address through this work. Okay, so enaction and contemplative education. So as you may or may not be aware, enaction takes a naturalistic approach that refutes representationalism and computational theories of cognition, and understands and construct the mind kind of as perceiving mental images of external objects that are then understood by processes in the brain. And instead, the enactivist approach sees sense-making as an active process of autopoietic beings that's inseparable from the embodied experience of the organism within its life world. This is a really important fundamental starting point, as far as I can understand, of enaction. And it's really important in terms of education. And this is very different from our standard models of education, which still largely focus on teaching us things about a world that exists out there separate from us, even where we have education that's more holistic in nature and includes things like social and emotional learning that we often see talked about in conjunction with contemplative education. These models remain constrained by their dualistic framing, in which meaning of the world is to be found out there. So what enaction does is offers us a groundless epistemological framing that allows us to confront the ultimate lack of foundations. And this understanding offers the possibility of seeing contemplative practice take effect, not through the gaining of additional propositional knowledge, but through important epistemological and ontological shifts. And I think this is currently missing from the work that we currently do. It's certainly missing in my previous work. So even where there are kind of more critical approaches to contemplative education or emancipatory approaches to education, these deeper shifts are often overlooked, and that there is a kind of an underlying kind of materialist, realist kind of assumption that these things are based on. So before I go any further, I just want to mention the use of my term transcendence in this talk. And Johanna, who sadly can't be here, but was very kindly gave me comments on a recent paper. One of her comments was, I think you need to define how you're using transcendence. And I have to say that my heart sank. I thought I was going to get away with not having to be very precise. I was not. And I'm very grateful to her actually for pushing me on this. And so I think it's important to explain what I mean. So I'm using the term transcendence not to refer to some distinct spiritual or higher realm that's kind of divorced from our everyday experience. Instead, transcendence in the way that I'm using it is about the process of aligning more closely with reality. And I'm really using John Vervaeke's work on this to present this definition. He describes how experience of transcendence have epistemological and ontological oomph or impact. So they can deeply, transcendence is about moving from our current position to a different one, a more holistic one, a bigger view. Okay, so let's move on. So overall, I think the enactivist approach in reflecting new understandings about cognition and how self and world are related can support the theorization of contemplative education, because it can help ensure that teaching and learning are faithful to new understandings of how the cosmos is constituted. And that's a beautiful, the teaching and learning are faithful to new understandings of how the cosmos is constituted is a beautiful quote from Parker Palmer, who has written a lot around contemplative pedagogy, and we'll hear from him a bit later. But I really think that the enactivist approach presents a lens where that becomes possible in a way that the way that we currently approach things might not be. Okay. Also, the little girl in this picture is my niece. And I just feel like in terms of an example of being in the moment, this photo just does it for me. So that's why she got included. Okay. Relevance realization. So I realize this is very kind of theory heavy, but I think when we're trying to create a new direction, we have to be thorough in the approach that we take. So I make no apologies for the slightly heavy nature of this. So another idea that I think may be helpful in developing our understanding of how contemplative education may lead to the development of wisdom is relevance realization. So relevance realization refers to the ongoing pre-conscious process that enables us as autopoietic beings to assess what matters, informing the appearance of our world. So combinatorial explosion refers to the possibility that as cognitive agents at any one time, there is always infinite numbers of things of which we could be aware. And Vervaeke and colleagues point out that there must be some process by which the world that is experienced is determined. Otherwise, we would be consistently overwhelmed and unable to engage with our environment. It's the foundational process that makes us intelligent, and it's what AI lacks. That's the only mention of AI you're going to get in this presentation, but there's a lot of discussion about relevance realization and AI. So it's the process or synergy of processes that frames our cognition, by which we are selecting the direction of our attention, appraising value, and rationing our attentional and physiological resources. Another way of looking at this is that it's about how we care about and for information. Yeah. Sorry, my husband's just pulled into the driveway, so I'm completely distracted, but I will be back with you. Okay. So relevance realization is fundamental to our enaction of the world and how the kind of being that we are, physiologically, psychologically, socially interacts with its environment, which Vervaeke and colleagues describe as the agent-arena relationship. Okay, so it's a very important underlying pre-conscious process. And relevance realization results in a relatively consistent experience of the world. But it is possible to break our current framing and reframe it, integrating new understanding. And this is related to the development of wisdom, which we're going to come on to in a minute. So the concept of relevance realization is important in relationship to contemplative education because it provides a model that fundamentally undermines the sense that we have in the West that we can come to know the world in a definite and final way. It encourages a sense of epistemic humility that is really important in wisdom. And we can also connect this idea to the work of Hannah de Jager, who has done a lot of work with Enaction. And she describes how organisms cast a web of significance on the world. In this world of significances, organisms moreover adapt because identity maintenance takes place in precarious circumstances. Living beings are continually threatened with disintegration from their own systemic organization and from their environment. And I could argue that the theory of relevance realization is the casting of this web of significance. Okay, so I've just got one final slide on relevance realization to try and make it a little clearer. So I'm going to read this quote because it's important. Cognition and cognitive processes are no longer seen as outside the environment, but considered to emerge from nonlinear and circular causality of continuous sensory motor interactions between brain, body, and environment. Cognition is regarded to be a temporal phenomenon and needs a dynamic system perspective. Relevance realization is then the underpinning of cognition as the exercise of skillful know-how in situated and embodied action, not reducible to pre-specified problem solving. So there's obviously an awful lot in there that we could unpack. But I think the key thing that I want you to take away is that by understanding that the process of relevance realization is going on, by appreciating its existence, it's possible to understand how experience is only ever one possible manifestation amongst an infinite array of possibilities. It can help us, I think, understand how the world is enacted, and the enactive approach provides the epistemological and ontological framework for the dynamical processes which support the arising of meaning making. And Viveke talks explicitly about the importance of a 4E cognitive science approach underpinning his theory of relevance realization. Interestingly, and I think it's important to note that they point out that it's never possible to have a theory of relevance because what is relevant to us is always dependent on the arising and ever-changing agent-arena relationship. So, for example, food becomes relevant once we become hungry. Yeah, once we become full, it's no longer relevant to us, something else becomes relevant to us. So the idea is that we need to understand the process of relevance realization because it's not possible to identify one thing as relevant and another thing as definitively not relevant. So what I'm going to do now is move on to the discussion of wisdom, and we'll come back to understanding how relevance realization is important for understanding the development of wisdom. So I'll kind of hold that thought. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so when looking back over the literature on wisdom and contemplative education, I've been quite interested to notice that I had kind of overlooked a lot of it. It's funny how we think we're reading the same thing, but actually with a different mind, we pick up on completely different things. So wisdom has played an interesting role in contemplative education writing. And you can see from the quotes on the slide that these writers are talking about reaching, through contemplative practice, reaching a very different understanding of the role, of the world, in which the role we play in meaning making is seen, is made explicit. But I'm not sure that we've taken this sufficiently in how we discuss contemplative education, largely because I think it's difficult to do so. And education at the moment is a difficult landscape, particularly higher education. I don't know whether people are aware, but there's a number of UK universities kind of struggling financially with lots of staff redundancies and things like that. And so there seems to be increasingly a focus on education, the importance of economic viability in education. It's become more about offering value for money, generating economic value through academic and industrial relationships, and providing appropriate skills for the workforce. And the idea of wisdom seems to have been put to one side. But again, these strong arguments for the development of greater wisdom as becoming more important as we face increasing complexity and increasing uncertainty. So Palmer et al. In 2010 outlined how modern ways of knowing contain within them a kind of violence that stems from the implied separation of knower and known. They describe how the cultivation of humanity has been forgotten for the sake of scientific simplification. And he uses another phrase, which I really like, which is atomistic facts about atomistic knowing. I really like that. Zions describes how the growth of interest in contemplative pedagogy can be described as a quiet revolution, which I really, really like. But he describes it as not just being about how we teach, but it's to question our knowing and knowledge. It's to question our very epistemology, methodology, and concept of comprehension. Therefore, interest in contemplation in education reflects not just as a desire to improve teaching and student experience, but has been accompanied by epistemological and ontological questioning that I don't think that we've taken very seriously yet. But I think this questioning becomes easier when we have the lens of enaction and relevance realisation to help us. Okay. So one of the challenges in talking about wisdom is really in the idea of how we define it. And so one of the best resources I found for this was a paper by Grossman et al. And they carried out a study with wisdom researchers and tried to pull together the different threads that each of these wisdom researchers thought was key to wisdom, to try and present an overarching theory. And they developed the idea of perspectival metacognition. And this isn't something that we're going to focus on as a theory, but what I wanted to draw out was the importance that they placed on this balance of viewpoints, epistemic humility, which I've already spoken about, context adaptability, and being able to take on multiple perspectives, and about how this then connects with our ability to respond to different contexts, different culture, different experience, as well as have kind of moral aspiration. So wisdom is required for the implementation of abstract and moral concepts. It allows people to see through illusion and self-deception, our framing of the world, and assists in survival-orientated coordination and long-term planning. But the key elements of it is this balance of viewpoints, epistemic humility, context adaptability, and multiple perspectives. So relating this to relevance realisation, we can see that flexibility to context is key in the development of wisdom. And wisdom is the appreciation that relevance and meaning is not a property of any particular feature in the world. It emerges through the process of self-world becoming. And because of the problems of combinatorial explosion, due to the infinite number of things to consider regarding taking a certain action and the unlimited range of potential outcomes, beings must find a way of framing problems so that they can be addressed. Therefore, wisdom cannot be rooted in propositional knowledge about the world, which is disconnected from being in the world. And this also establishes an important relationship between being and awareness of being and ethics, which is something I'll be emphasizing at ESRI. Yeah. Okay. And to come back to Hannah de Jager's work, she says, something we care about, of course. Sorry, what we care about, of course, is what's relevant to us. Only if we care about something can we choose the appropriate kind of action. Only by acting in the world can we get to know it. This is the very, very foundation of our knowledge and our morals. It is also what connects us to the rest of the living world. Life is meaningful and precious that way. So these connections between wisdom and ethics are being drawn in various different places and have a very strong history in philosophy. And Barratt also picks up on a similar thread. He explains how the cultivation of wisdom should be the basis of our being here. If we start with the appreciation of being as it is, then practical action, how we act in the world with our theoretical knowledge, will have the kind of prudence that it needs to have. So an understanding of relevance realization helps us to appreciate that however we are looking at a situation, there are infinite other ways to do so. Our meaning making is relational, processual, and dynamic. It does not have a ground where the meaning or significance is located. We do not attribute meaning to the world. Neither does the world contain meaning that we then perceive. Real wisdom comes from awareness. Here summarized as perspectival metacognition. Okay. So how do we link these ideas? How do we bring them together? And this is really around the process of becoming wiser. We can talk about what wisdom is, but actually as educators, what we really need to know is how we develop people's wisdom. How do we as educators become wiser, more to the point? So wisdom arises from seeing, or perhaps finding relevant, different possibilities and affordances that were not possible previously given the world that we had enacted. Vervaeke talks about breaking and reframing as reciprocal opening. Things are seen and experienced differently, opening up the possibilities of new ways of being through shifts in our knowing. Becoming wise, therefore, includes increased sensitivity to beauty, to wonder, to awe, experiences that can support seeing beyond what our current framing allows. Breaking frame is a term he used to describe the initial sense that one has the wrong end of the stick, or that one's understanding is limited. And it's when we notice that the possibility for opening arises. And he describes how meditation can help us break frame by making what was once transparent and opaque, by making what was once transparent opaque, so that we can appreciate the lens through which we've previously been looking at and distorting the world, and notice the limitations of that lens. No, I'm just going to leave that right. Okay. And along with the idea of breaking frame and opening to new understanding of the world, to other people, Vervaeke also discusses reciprocal narrowing. So this is what happens when we become incredibly fixed in our worldview. And there are arguments that actually addiction works through this process of reciprocal narrowing. It limits the choices that we're able to make in a situation, and that can become a perpetual cycle. But just as reciprocal narrowing can become a vicious cycle, reciprocal opening can become a virtuous circle. And we see similar notions again in Hannah de Jager's work, who identifies the risk of over-determining things or people. This is where we come to a very fixed and definite understanding of something. She says, we can be over-deterministic when a big part of the knowing is determined by the knower, that sense that we really know something really strongly, and a smaller part by the known. This is an over-determining and thereby a limiting of knowing. And she emphasizes the right amount of determining, which fits with the idea of wisdom being described here, with the idea of epistemic humility and inviting the possibility of balance, of openness. Yeah. So an important aspect of this is that just thinking about what to say. Yeah, an important aspect of this is that reciprocal opening and the transcendence that that affords assumes the groundlessness of things. And we need a theoretical model that allows for that possibility. So this is a quote from Melling, who describes groundlessness in the context of the enactive approach. And he says, a world is not pre-given, but enacted through sense-making. Most importantly, sense-making is not a fixed process or thing. It does not have substantial existence. Instead, it is groundless. It springs from a dynamic of relations without substantial ground. Thereby, as all cognition is groundless, this groundlessness is considered the central underlying principle of cognition. And what's really important in linking these ideas is that if we take on board the groundlessness of things, there is no end point to knowing, and therefore wisdom becomes boundless. Without a ground, there is not something to come to a better understanding of. It is understanding itself that we need to transcend and embrace infinite complexity. Without an appreciation of groundlessness in the models we use, this is not possible, because there is always something ultimate that we think we should be able to come to know. Okay, so now for my incredibly crude attempt to try and link these ideas. Ta-da! So, yeah, I haven't done a diagram like this since my PhD, and I'm not sure I've got any better at it, but there we are. So at the base, we've got contemplative education, and I haven't tried to define what that is, because I think that that is a topic in and of itself. What I have done is acknowledged some key areas that I think need to be included when we're thinking about contemplative education. So we need to think seriously about pedagogical theory, about what we already know about teaching and learning. We need to think about the learning environment and outcomes, and this is really important, I think, particularly when we're working within institutions. We then need to think about student characteristics. Who is it that we're trying to teach? And we also need to bear in mind the teacher's knowledge and skills. So these are all really important factors in deciding what contemplative education should look like in any particular context. The next step up is the range of contemplative meditative practices themselves. And this includes a really wide range of possibilities of things. And we could spend a lot of time talking about what should be included, what shouldn't, about the similarities and differences between them, but we're not going to do that today. But I suggest that the thing that they need to have in common is, in some way, is to develop awareness that includes, but is not limited to, awareness of self and inner experience, but may also include connection and relationship with the world and with other people. I've also mentioned embodiment in the diagram explicitly, so as not to create a sense that this is somehow some kind of mental training that is not embodied. Sometimes when I'm teaching meditation, I might say something, when I talk about why we do a body scan, I talk about the fact that we're not meditating as heads on sticks. And I think that's really what I'm trying to capture here. Our students aren't minds on sticks in classrooms. And then the next step up in the diagram is this idea that these practices might allow for breaking frame and reciprocal opening. And then this is followed by reframing and insight. And this is my attempt to capture the idea that our current view has to shift, or at least be experienced as limited for new perspectives to emerge. And this may be about different views on topics, better understanding of the things that we're trying to teach our students. But importantly, there is also the possibility of epistemological and ontological shifts. And this may then lead to the development of wisdom and result in the development of virtue, ethical sensitivity, and human flourishing. Nussbaum in the paper in 2019 talks about human flourishing being a key aspect that distinguishes wisdom from intelligent decision-making or just good common sense. So flourish in this context is not simply about success, happiness, well-being, but crucially includes what Nussbaum describes as grounding in moral virtues, including the civic virtues such as civility, compassion, and fairness, which I think is a really beautiful description. But as it stands in education in the West, the way that we teach seems to reflect this idea that meaning lies outside and separate from us. We're not provided with opportunities to see how we are intimately implicated with the unfolding of life. But at its most profound, I think that is what contemplative education offers. And this is important in and of itself because we are constrained individually and collectively by our ignorance, particularly if it is ignorance that we cannot see and that cannot be made visible within our dominant ways of knowing the world, particularly subject-object duality. So our ability to create lives in which we're able to thrive is only as great as our understanding of what is unfolding. And our capabilities are constrained by our capacity to conceptualize what the problem might be. So this has real world impact. Okay, so I'm now, you'll be pleased to know, coming to the summary. Okay, so coming back to Parker Palmer, helping students come to terms with reality is a fundamental aim of higher education, an unattainable goal when the unexamined foundations of education, the hidden curriculum, are atomistic and competitive rather than interconnected and communal. So what I'm talking about has implications not only for contemplative education, but for education as a whole. And these are questions that have been asked elsewhere too. I'm not alone in this. So in short, the enactivist approach and the theory of relevance realisation can help us understand contemplative education as a means of developing wisdom, because it overcomes the epistemological and ontological assumptions of modern scientific understanding which underpin education and ultimately constrict how it is possible to know the world. So by moving beyond what's described as, academic knowing in the quote above, or what Vervaeke describes as propositional knowing, the door is open to deeper ways of knowing as awareness is developed through meditative and contemplative practice. So in my view, contemplative education offers the possibility of putting wisdom into right relationship with knowing. And obviously there is a very crucial and important relationship between those things. But wisdom is not about what you know, but developing a contextually and ethically sensitive awareness of our own delusion, our framing, and a commitment to overcome that delusion in relationship with self, other, and world. And by using the enactivist approach, contemplative education can be seen to offer a way to wisdom embedded within the context of how beings care for life itself, which is what the enactive approach gives us. And through this caring, manifested in relevance realisation, a world is enacted, and it is suggested that through familiarisation with how ways of knowing operate in self-world enactment, wisdom is developed. And as I've already said, this has serious implications for education as a whole. And I'm starting to realise that the questions that I'm posing in this exploration have potentially far-reaching consequences than I had anticipated. And it actually occurred to me the other day about what would happen, what would education look like if its aim was to support the unfolding of life rather than being constrained within finite projects of self. Yeah, where would we start with that? Where would we start with that? Dubé in 2023 said that individuals will first need to liberate themselves from the past, from what they already know and take for granted about what education is or what it is to be educated. So we're potentially asking some fundamental questions about what education actually means. But coming back to contemplative education, contemplative practices offer the potential for developing awareness that results in a more direct experience of being and a richer understanding of how that experience comes to be. They can expose how it is the groundlessness of being which affords the possibility of transcendence, this ongoing reciprocal opening that is the basis of wisdom and virtue, that has no horizon and no limit. So in the words of Whitehead, education needs to become a place in which students become acquainted with life as it is known in the midst of living it, because it is from this that wisdom can arise. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sāgaradevī. As we discussed before the meeting, you asked for ime a minute or two break.
Yep.
That everyone can grab a little drink and can dive deeper into one's mind.
Right.
Coming back with good questions. So we are going to take that 1 or 2 minute break, just a short one, really, to have a drink and come back together. I'm going to do the same.
Thank you.
Welcome. Welcome. Let's wait a little bit. Seems that we are back, more or less. So we can have about half an hour discussion or so, depending on the questions, of course, and the intensiveness or intensity of dialogue. I would like to invite everyone to consider questions or clarifications even. There might be some. Leslie is raising her hand. So Leslie, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sāgaradevī. There was a lot of wisdom there. Very interesting. Education is obviously so incredibly important. I was very interested in trying to define the word transcendence, because often we think of it in spiritual terms, and I think you made it very clear that we're not. And I noted two ways that you defined it. One, the process of aligning more with reality, or moving from a current position to a new one, which I really think is good. The second one there, moving to a new position to transcend whatever it was there that we were stuck in. But the first one, now I'm curious about the definition of reality.
Yeah. And
not to put you on the spot, but it's aligning more with reality. That's a hard one for me.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that what what John Vervaeke is pointing to when he says that is this idea that we're letting go of that fixed sense of knowing something and making space for the kind of the mysterious reality that we ultimately can't know. That's my understanding of it. So I don't think it's that there's some
reality out there.
No, absolutely not. No, definitely not.
Awesome. Thanks. There's a lot more to say about everything you showed us. It was really, really, really wonderful. So thanks. I think that's an important word, transcendent.
Yeah, and also just to say that, some of John's discussion is kind of really saying that although he is not saying that there's this separate spiritual divine world, he's really questioning the use of the word sacred. Mm-hmm. So he still feels that there is a sacredness, but that that it doesn't exist separately. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting kind of area of work, and I think when Johanna asked me to define it, there was that sense of, oh God.
So often people identify it too very quickly with religion or with
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
It's a good word though.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Leslie. Villeke.
Yes, I actually had a similar question related to wisdom. Thank you very much for your presentation, by the way. It's really, really great work. But I wondered what your definition of wisdom is and whether you consider that there is something such as innate wisdom, because I heard you say different things about wisdom. So, for example, at the end, you said transcendental opening is a basis for wisdom and virtue. And I think I also heard you say that wisdom is the process that you are describing. But I also wondered if wisdom is needed to actually have this relevance realization. So in order to select what is meaningful, maybe you need to have a deeper sense of wisdom. But of course, that's a big question, and it can easily become a dualistic thing as well. Is there wisdom that we need to reach for, or is it an enactive thing?
Yeah,
so I wondered about your thoughts about that.
Very interesting. So I definitely think it's an enactive thing. And I think that relevance realization is something that happens kind of pre-cognition. One of the quotes I've read today is that relevance realization is the framing of our cognition, and that even like single cell bacteria are realizing relevance through the nature of their autopoietic being. So we're talking about a very fundamental kind of process of life when we're talking about relevance realization. But I think when you think about the development of human beings and those that we kind of consider wise, it is interesting how sometimes you meet someone and you just get that sense and you're not quite sure what it is that they've kind of got. I think in terms of defining wisdom, I think the model I put the diagram up on, it's not a definition, but it's one of the best working models that I've seen of wisdom. I think actually defining wisdom is quite challenging because it actually draws on a lot of different elements, but when they combine, they seem to produce this thing that we then call wisdom. But the one thing I think that's really being emphasized is that it's not just about what you know about something. It's more about being able to hold the provisional nature of your knowing at all times, or as much as humanly possible, so that you can be open to kind of different perspectives, and that has, through that epistemic humility, that then enables us to kind of develop an ethical outlook, and that there is then a relationship between this ethical outlook and human flourishing. But yeah, when I started to write about this, I thought, I'll just find a definition of wisdom for the paper. So, oh God, it's just a huge area, but it's an interesting thing to reflect on.
Thank you, Villeke. Amy.
Thank you so much, Sāgaradevī. That was fantastic. I have a whole bunch of different questions, but just I want to throw one over, I think, to Gabor, because in my understanding of phenomenology, the notion of the transcendental is actually the closest to being with what things are. So there's a sort of a non a definition from phenomenology, for example, from Husserlian phenomenology, that brings the transcendental into the realm of the epoche. Am I being correct there in that sense of transcendental? So suspending the suspension of the epoche. So there are definitions of transcendental, and I'm not a philosopher, but of that term that bring it into this alignment with reality that you're talking about. And I think you might find that in Husserlian. I mean, I'm looking to Gabor because he's our neighborhood philosopher. But bring it down from our kind of general feeling that transcendental somehow means above.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the term transcendental, how it originated, it came from Kant, Immanuel Kant, and it meant to be the conditions for the possibility of something. Conditions for, and in many cases, it's what are the conditions for the possibility of knowledge, or what are the conditions for the possibility of understanding, or the possibility of meaning, the possibility of wisdom, in this case, in the context of Sāgaradevi's talk. So transcendental and transcendence are different in a way. And it was Kant who wanted to create this difference in order to understand the conditions, the possibility of anything, instead of understanding transcendence as a mystical realm beyond this sphere of existence. The meaning of transcendental is mystical enough. We don't need to pose another domain of existence to be able to just to feel the vastness and the depth of this reality as such, and the phenomena as such. And then more phenomenologists after Husserl try to dig deeper and deeper and deeper and understand the conditions for the possibility of existence as such. And I think that's where we end up basically framing or having an autopoietic understanding of life, and also an active understanding of reality, and a relational epistemology, and a process ontology. In the end, all those come from this understanding, according to my perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting because actually I think when we talk about contemplative practices, because a lot of them come from a religious framing, there is this assumption about transcendence being something else, about being, something quote unquote spiritual. And so I think it could be an interesting area of discussion, because I'm sure some people will feel very differently about that definition of transcendence.
But I think also you might find some interesting bits in Evan Thompson's book, Mind in Life.
Yeah.
On that very term.
Okay.
In line with what Gabor was saying. But I actually had another comment, which was that maybe is asking for some clarification. So I'm wondering about this notion of breaking frame. So I understand, I love the notion of epistemic humility, and I love the idea of breaking frame. And I'm not sure about the idea of reciprocal opening. I think that, I mean, there is a lineage, in the enactive material, there's a lineage of the idea of breakdown, which is incredibly fruitful, because through Francisco and through Hannah and Ezekiel's work and Evan's work, you have this notion that, in fact, meaning making takes place through breakdowns.
Interesting. Yeah.
So when we're trying to be together in some way, we have to, this is the adaptive place also, we have to keep adjusting to the situation.
Yep.
And there are breakdowns, and we adjust to breakdown, and so it's in fact, it's what Hannah also calls friction.
Nice. Yeah.
As being generative of meaning, because it's actually through the breakdown. And I wonder if that could be fruitfully related to this notion of breaking frame as well.
Yeah, I think that sounds really helpful, actually. Sounds really helpful. And yeah, the reciprocal opening, I think, is a term that he uses less often. But I like it in the sense that the example he gives is, in relationships, we kind of say something about ourselves to someone, and if it's a kind of, then perhaps in response to that, they may share something with us, and then we share something else with them, and then there is this pattern. We seem to know how to respond to that opening in other people, and equally we do the opposite. You know, if we share something and no one comes back with anything, then we kind of shut down. So there is this kind of opening, and also our understanding of the world can be like that. When the world starts to seem a bit different to us, it feels different, it feels more expansive or something, we do that same thing again to try and find more of that openness, so that there is this sense of it being a process that kind of reinforces itself if it's allowed to kind of work. But I think all of those terms are very difficult to be either very precise or very definite. This is one thing and that's another. They're kind of all interrelated, and perhaps if we, depending on what's most helpful to use going forward, those terms would need to become a little bit more distinct and clear. And I'm particularly interested in the relationship between the term insight, which is often offered and used within the Buddhist tradition, and breaking frame and making frame, because there's a very close relationship between those. But I'm not sure quite enough yet what the differences and similarities are. But yeah, thank you.
I would also like to ask a question, Sāgaradevī. You were talking about definition of transcendence, definition of wisdom. I would wonder, I mean, I understood the connection between wisdom and the ethical outlook. I think you described that very beautifully, kind of an interconnected and interrelated domain or domains. I wonder whether we still need to use the term contemplative education after all this, or whether we are already somehow beyond that phrase. And I would just wonder how you would define or interpret or put it in context, this term contemplative education, especially, I mean, the two aspects of this term, contemplative on the one hand and education on the other. I think we are beyond education here now. And I also feel that somehow the term contemplative might not be enough or deep enough for moving forward. I'm not sure.
I think you're probably right. And I was being interviewed for a YouTube video the other day, and someone asked me about what contemplative pedagogy meant, and I was just like, oh, it is really, really tough. And I think perhaps the fact that we haven't really been able to grasp it in a meaningful way illustrates that it's never quite been right, but we've never really been sure what it is that we're pointing at. And I think once we've become a bit clearer about what we're pointing to when we're talking about contemplative education, which I really hope this work is going to feed into, perhaps then we can call it something different, because it feels like at the moment we're kind of stuck with the description at the level of method rather than a description at the level of outcome or aim or perspective, but we're definitely stuck at the method. And we kind of, in order to research it in a meaningful way, we need to move beyond that. But I'm also very aware that I don't have anything in my back pocket that I think is a better fit for where we're at the moment, because I think that there is even though it's not completely clear and easy to define, I do think that there is a shared understanding about what it means between quite a lot of educators, and that community is important. And so I would be reluctant to kind of be too kind of critical and move away from it too quickly, when actually there's a lot of valuable work that's being done under that kind of banner. So, but perhaps there's an evolution there to be encouraged.
Yes, I think you're right. I would still be curious to hear how you would not define, maybe just translate or interpret the term contemplative.
Yeah.
In your model or in your context.
Yeah. So I think that I tend to use the term to relate to the use of particular practices where there is some element or a strong element of kind of awareness, where awareness becomes the development of awareness is central to the practice, no matter what that practice is. So it might be a meditation, or it might be a reflection on a text, but there is a very strong sense of deeper thought that goes beyond the normal development of intellectual kind of knowledge. That for me has been important, but I'm not sure that that's widely shared. And again, I think a lot of the time we're getting stuck at the level of method rather than what we're actually trying to reach.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. Ida.
Yeah, thank you for your beautiful talk. And my question connects a little bit to the discussion which is just going on now. You being in the UK are probably familiar with the Mindfulness in Schools project, and the Myriad study, which was a huge study over 7 years, I think. And I don't know the details of the outcome of these studies, the several studies actually, but I do know that, the expectations were high, and, the outcome was much lower.
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course, this is really based, I'm quite familiar with the curriculum of mindfulness, the .b and .pause. And it's very much based on awareness and embodiment and awareness practices. But it turned out that most children weren't really engaged in this. So I wonder if you could say something about your thoughts about this, your ideas.
Yeah, thank you. And that, that study, as well as others, has, I said about that being important context in my thinking. So, so I think the results were really disappointing in terms of the level of positive outcome. And also, they really commented that most of the young people weren't doing it at home either. And then I thought about the teenagers that I know or have experienced, and the kind of lack of surprise in a way, like, why do we think that we're going to be able to tell them what to do and they're going to do it? But I think it was but I think it was incredibly helpful to have such a robust study. In terms of research, they did such a good job actually, and really raised some important questions. So there's the lack of positive outcome, the possibility for some groups of negative outcomes, and then the lack of engagement from some of the young people. And one of my main concerns around mindfulness in schools is around consent. So someone was on Twitter this week saying about the importance when you're engaging in, I think they were talking about mindfulness practice in particular, the importance of being in a place of psychological safety. And for a lot of students, and even for some staff, schools are not a place of psychological safety. And I've really been concerned as a kind of mindfulness and meditation teacher with that hat on about how you encourage people to practice, but don't make it essential for them to do so. And that's difficult when you've got 37-year-olds. How do you give them a choice about whether they engage or not? And how do you have the resources to then support any children that find those practices difficult? So that's been a source of concern. And even within higher education, where I've led kind of practices within a classroom, kind of meditative practices, which I actually don't do very much anymore, I've always had this slight nagging feeling that although I say you don't have to do this if you don't want to, even though I'm teaching adults, even though they could get up and leave or just not do the practice, I always give them an alternative task to do. But still, there's that sense of me being the teacher, them being the students, and that possibility of feeling compelled to do something. And that's a discomfort that's grown on me over time. And I think raises really important questions around what we mean by contemplative education and how we make it appropriate. And that's why I really emphasized in that diagram the importance of things like learning theory, who the students are, those kind of things. So I hope that gives some.
If I may just add something, we had a talk by Ferris Jaber some weeks ago in Mind and Life Europe, and his book Becoming Earth is just out now, I think, and I thought, you know, that's so wonderful, because this book seems, I haven't read it yet, but it seems to describe from the outside in, you know, how interconnected the world is. So maybe that's not a contemplative approach, of course, but maybe this could be combined and to make, you know, people aware of this interconnectedness on a conceptual level, and make them and induce the wonder and the awe and the you know, the beauty of things, and come from that side also.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, in the discussion that we've just had around being stuck at the level of method by labeling it contemplative education, when actually what we want to get to is what are we pointing to through contemplative practice. And, you know, like the book and the framing that you've just discussed, that opens the door to the same place, but we may not call it contemplative. So it kind of really brings in that aspect of the discussion. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ida. Ingrid, please.
Yes, thank you. It's a wonderful, really interesting topic, and it's also challenging.
Yeah.
But I'm very happy that I could listen to you. It's really interesting. And I was thinking about a few themes. So I just will take one or two about it. So my first question was about the implementation, and we just started to talk a little bit about that. But I'm working in teacher education, German didactics, and yes, I'm really interested in how to bring wisdom to education. And I was thinking, we use this word contemplative education, and that I think I'm living in Switzerland, and maybe society is conservative and a little bit frightened about strange words in some places. Teacher education is more or less conservative, and if we say contemplative education, would it not be better to be more direct and to say, for example, education to wisdom, and connect it with philosophing with children, for example? But wisdom, when I talk about wisdom, I have to take a lot of care with that, because it's a problem of definition. Maybe you want to say something about this subject of implementation in teacher education.
Interesting. So I think I really like that kind of wisdom framing. I think is quite kind of a sensible approach, and I think that perhaps the term contemplative education is unhelpful on multiple levels. But firstly, because it doesn't give many clues to what we're actually talking about in terms of how it looks in the classroom. So because I think that the contemplative education doesn't have to look like someone meditating in a classroom. You know, there's lots of kind of different approaches that we can use around kind of deepening reading, deepening reflection, encouraging kind of participatory group work to try and kind of grapple with things. There are different philosophical approaches which I think we would perhaps include under that might fit under the contemplative education banner, but that might not kind of get kind of included, if you like. John Vervaeke, whose work I've mentioned a lot, he considers himself to be a Neoplatonist, so he's drawing on a lot of different kind of philosophical traditions in the kind of the ways that he's kind of helping people develop wisdom. And some of it is teaching them very directly, you know, about what wisdom is. And I think that that's very interesting, because very often we talk about contemplative education to support the development of learning in subjects that we're already teaching. So I work in the School of Health and Social Care. So how do we use it to support the development of nurses, to support the development of social workers and those kind of things? But I think we could also perhaps, if we got a bit clearer about what we were pointing to, start to be a bit more direct about that, and then find other ways that didn't necessitate practices which might be viewed as controversial within an education setting, but still opened up the possibility of depth for people. And so I think the points you've raised are really interesting and really tie into some of the other things that we've mentioned.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ingrid.
May.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. So I've actually had lots of questions which along the way people have already talked about, which is great. And then so the only thing that kind of connects with what we've been talking about, sort of implementation side, and also this consent thing that you mentioned, is I mean, the word that comes to me is like prerequisite, but it's more almost like in the search for wisdom. I think a lot of traditions that that I've come across, you know, spiritual traditions, wisdom traditions, sort of had a sort of like there would be like, you know, people who are just asleep, and then people who start to have some sort of, you know, search. Yeah. Or starting, like there's something innate that's already happening, and that's when they start to be open to, you know, so but obviously, but that's where it's like it's different when somebody's coming to you. Versus when you're trying to just implement it.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I think, and I think this is where it's really important within education that we are doing things that support the overall educational goal and don't get too caught up in the possible depth of contemplative experience, because people will access it in very different ways and will have very different experiences from engaging in something. So we can't kind of predict the metaphor I know is about the lotus flowers, so which ones are open and which ones are closed and in the mud. But I wonder, and I guess this is the bigger question that's kind of motivating my work, is I wonder whether our education system is currently just supporting the continuation of delusion, because it's framed in such a way that the possibility of waking up, of gaining insight, of transcendence, however we might kind of explore it, is fundamentally limited by the way in which we view knowledge, the way in which we, just the way in which we frame the world as a society. And I hope that there is a possibility of designing an education system in which, whatever stage of development someone might be at, whatever their level of awareness might be, we might be able to at least create an education system which makes the arising of wisdom more likely, whilst also recognizing that everyone will be kind of at different levels. So I think that's a really, really good point. A really good point. And you know, when people are searching for wisdom, like in a kind of spiritual search, where they find a place of practice that's kind of self-directed, they're kind of looking for something. And also, it's important to really respect, you know, different traditions, different cultures, different religions, and you know, that's a challenge. Oh, bless her. Yeah. Does that answer your question, May?
Yes, yeah. Something else came in my head, but I've forgotten now.
More important things, that's good.
We have got a beautiful comment in the chat from Marianka.
Oh, great.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for your important work. And thanks everybody for the interesting discussion. I'm sorry that I'm not able to put my camera on. Personally, I like to see the meaning of wisdom as embodied knowledge, which or that shows also the difference between knowledge and wisdom. I like you mentioned the importance of embodiment.
Yeah, I think if we're going to use an enactive kind of framing, then embodiment's kind of built into that. But I still feel like for people that are new to these ideas, the embodiment needs to be stressed because it may not be immediately apparent.
Yeah, and I also wanted to come back to your last point that you mentioned as a response to May's question. You mentioned the term education system and the challenges with that, and I often think that when you think about these systems, or when we focus on education, for example, we tend to think in silos that society is built up from these systems, education system here, healthcare system over there. And I think that's also part of the problem.
Yeah.
And I often wonder whether instead of trying to design or define or develop a new education system or a new healthcare system, whether we would just simply step back and define or design I don't like these terms, define, design, live or practice a different relation system.
Yeah.
Because that goes back to a whole system approach that, you know, it includes families, it includes society, it includes interactions, all sorts of interactions between people. And that's where I think Hannah and Ezekiel's work on participatory sense making as a development or a continuation of the enactive approach can be useful, because we go back to the very central point on relationality and on relations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly in the UK as well, we see I've not had kind of young children of my own where I've kind of guided them through school as a step parent. I've been mercifully very much on the edge of that. But when I've seen friends kind of parenting, there's often quite almost an adversarial relationship between the school and the parent pushing for something for the child and the school not responding in a certain way. And that atmosphere seems to have created a real tension that I'm not sure was there when I was young. And that quite frightens me, really, in terms of this. We're trying to create these human beings that are loving and intelligent and wise, but actually there seems to be quite a lot of obstacles in the way that we're doing things that potentially constrain that. And you know, and that's really, it's so deep rooted in how we are together sometimes. That
the first challenge or the first issue with that is probably that they cannot be created like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Amy, please.
But also, just in line with this topic of discussion, when I was thinking about it's in line with actually what Ida was saying, and also a little bit with what May was saying, is that if we want to go back to the difference between propositional knowledge and sense-making type knowledge, we've already got a big project there in thinking about the relation between the teacher and the student, because the student sees the knowledge as being in the teacher, and that's the way the institution works, and or in the parents, you know. And so I wonder what, and that seems to be a very basic kind of psychological function. There's even a word for it in psychoanalysis. The other is the subject supposed to know. And that's part of the motor of learning, is presuming that somebody else knows something and wanting to know it. You know, so it's actually very, very structural. Whereas I think in contemplative and also in guru-student relationships as well, right? So in that relationship and in other therapeutic relationships, the goal is to stay with your position, say, as the teacher or the subject supposed to know.
Yeah.
But to use that position to continue to encourage the ongoing meaning making in the student or the other. So it's not, oh, you've got it right. It's and more and more and more. You know, so what you were talking about earlier about creating contemplative style interventions that aren't, you know, directly real Buddhist-y. But that I mean, sorry about that, but you know, but that are, it would seem to me that it would be this encouragement to keep on meaning making.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the, is it Socratic questioning really does that? Like there's definitely some, you know, older kind of philosophical stuff that I'm only just finding out about, that I'm like, oh, this isn't new. Which has been quite a revelation. So yeah, I think there's different ways of doing it.
Through dialogue, education.
Yeah.
But it's, I think Igor's right. It's relationality. It's the in between that needs to be focused on, not the one, you know, or the whole thing. But it's really, we haven't paid enough attention to the in between.
Yeah, and actually, I haven't really explored it explicitly, but that's made me think that there is some good work in educational theory about the power of the teacher and how you navigate that to create this more creative. And I'm just wondering actually whether this lens of sense making could really bring a nice enrichment to some of that work actually. Yeah. Interesting. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Sāgaradevī, and thank you all. I may just, before the final slide, the title slide for upcoming events, I would just maybe quote Whitehead, who you refer to in the end of your talk, is one of the culture heroes for me. He talks about education. He has a book on education, The Aims of Education, and he says, from the very beginning of his or her education, the child should experience the joy of discovery. The discovery which he or she has to make is that general ideas give an understanding of that stream of events which pours through his or her life, which is his or her life. So, yeah.
Thanks, Gabor.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Derek, if you have the slide, just for some of you who might be interested in joining us on July 9th, we have this Making Room for Contemplation sessions once a month. It's a practice session open to all without very specific formats. We are just together in a room and share our togetherness contemplatively. And then the ISV event is coming at the end of July, beginning of August, and you will be there, Sāgaradevī, and you are going to talk more there. And hopefully the meeting today was leading to that wider engagement with students and postdoctoral colleagues, researchers, practitioners, professionals there. So, and I'm sure many of you will come to Esri this year. Thank you so much. And
thank you so much, Sāgaradevī.
No problem. Thank you very much, everyone.
And Derek.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Amy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all. Bye.
Wish you a good. Bye.